Happy New Year and welcome to the January 2026 European Respiratory Journal podcast. My name is James Chalmers and I'm the chief editor of the European Respiratory Journal, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first podcast of the year. One of the things I love about this podcast and the podcast series is the diversity of different topics that we get to talk about every month. And we've got a real cracker this month, which is talking about the effects of cannabis on the lung, a really interesting topic. And to discuss this in detail, I'm delighted to be joined by Janice Leung. Janice, please introduce yourself.
Well, thank you for having me and Happy New Year to you as well. So I am a respirologist in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia, and I've been interested in novel exposures of the airway leading to airways diseases such as COPD and asthma. And one of our interests recently has been cannabis smoking, because in 2018, we legalized cannabis here in Canada. We were actually the second country in the world to do so. And so we had a unique opportunity to study cannabis smoking, and that led to this paper.
I was doing a little bit of reading preparing for this. So I downloaded the European Drug Report, and looking at this, it says 3 to 4% of adults in Europe smoke cannabis on a semi-regular basis, 1% or so daily use of cannabis. Yeah, and it varies by country. So there's some countries where it's much higher.
Right.
Maybe about 15% of young adults are regularly smoking cannabis in Europe is what that report says. But in Canada, where it's been legalized, I was seeing that it's much higher than that. So daily use is more like 1 in 20 people, and intermittent use is even more common. So maybe first question would be just, what has been the impact of legalization on the frequency of use of cannabis in Canada?
Right. So we've been tracking this through surveys in our country since 2018, the legalization. And generally, about 25% of our population have used cannabis within the last 12 months. It's a quite prevalent habit, much more so now than cigarette smoking. It's more likely to be found in younger people. So I think we have to consider what the long-term implications of that is going to be. About 60 to 70% will be using cannabis via smoking. But what's been interesting is actually the increase in cannabis vaping. So that has actually increased significantly over the last 6 years as well.
Canada is clearly the place to do this study. So tell us about the study that's been published in the ERJ. What did you do and what did you find?
Out of legalization, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research decided to put a call for greater study of the health impacts of cannabis. And in particular, they funded a respiratory grant, which we were able to win in 2019. And so what we decided to do was to do a really detailed approach to cannabis smoking and its impact on the airway, from clinical to imaging, to functional outputs, all the way down to the molecular airway cell level. And so we did a range of testing for cannabis smokers, your standard respiratory symptom scores, all the way down to a bronchoscopy. The other, I think, novel thing that we had was functional imaging. So in addition to structural imaging using quantitative CT, we also had hyperpolarized xenon gas MRI to really look at functional imaging and ventilation defects in the lung. So it was very sort of a cell-to-patient approach to the impact of cannabis smoking. We found several things. One is that it's actually quite rare, at least in the Vancouver area, to be just a cannabis smoker. We were very liberal about who we accepted into the cohort because we wanted this to be a real-world reflection of cannabis smoking habits. The majority of our cannabis smoking population had some other exposure, whether that be cigarette smoking or actually cigarette smoking and vaping. I think that's something that we need to be aware of as clinicians and providers to really understand the real world habits of what our community is inhaling. The second thing is that when you look at the severity of cannabis smoking, the more you're smoking, the worse you are feeling. So definitely an increase in respiratory symptoms, whether that be by the St. George's Respiratory Questionnaire or by the COPD assessment test. We found some degree of pulmonary function abnormality with lower FEV1 to FEC ratios, higher quantitative emphysema, more ventilation defects on MRI, and on bronchoscopy, some aberration in Th2, Th17 inflammation, and also mucin gene regulation. The last thing we did was we actually took those airway epithelial cells and grew them in culture and took a look at the mucin gene expression in the air-liquid interface models, and also found that this gene expression in the bronchoscopy samples were matched by protein level at the air liquid interface cultures. And that mucin gene expression and mucin protein expression was significantly correlated with those respiratory symptoms, poor lung function, emphysema, and ventilation defects. Altogether, I would say that there is likely an injury signal here. And my recommendation as a provider to my patients would be, I don't think cannabis smoking is all that healthy for you. And we need to think about cessation and how to get your lungs working back together. Now, the general population may not really consider cannabis smoking to be as harmful as cigarette smoking, but I think there's enough data in our papers to suggest that it's not benign, especially when you consider the average age of our population, which is, in their high 20s, early 30s. So these are young people, and that's concerning. And maybe 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, we might be seeing a lot more disease.
You touched there on a question that's probably the one that the member of the general public would ask, or that some of our listeners may ask is, okay, this is harmful. There's a damage signal. Yeah. How does this compare to conventional cigarette smoking?
This is a question that unfortunately we were unable to answer in our paper, because as best as we were trying to recruit a tobacco-only population, it was actually quite difficult to do so in Vancouver. And maybe that is just reflection of the fact that, tobacco smoking is lower. In British Columbia, it's only about 7% of the population. And so we had all intentions to have a comparison tobacco smoking population, and actually found it quite difficult to recruit. A lot of people were doing cannabis and cigarette smoking together.
Yeah.
But without that tobacco only group, it was hard for us to make any conclusions on that. And that is a limitation. And I certainly concede that we might not be able to answer that question in the paper. That said, if that's not a reflection of what my community is doing, maybe we're moving on to a different sort of inhalational toxin world now. And second, one of the counter arguments would be, does it matter if it's still harming you? The message should still be, maybe we should still quit cannabis smoking. So I welcome other attempts in other communities to try to answer that question. It was difficult for us to do so. Maybe that's a reflection of our success in getting cigarette smoking down. We now have a different problem, which may be vaping and cannabis smoking.
Yeah, nobody can criticize you in terms of the groups that you include, because if you included a smoking group, they would said, what about vaping? What about...
I will tell you, it becomes very, very complicated now to sort these groups out. And I hand it to my students and my postdocs who would wrestled with how to divide the groups and subgroup. It becomes very, very challenging. So I think that's the other sort of, new horizon in pulmonary research now, is that we do have to account for all of these different inhalational habits that people are doing together. They may stop some, start some, go on and off. And I think there's a complexity there that's not just like, easily quantifiable smoking pack years. We're in a different realm now.
We're in a different world now.
Yeah, exactly.
But I like your message that the lungs were made for fresh air and not for anything else, which is very reasonable conclusion. There's some pointers there that some of the pathophysiology is similar to early COPD, isn't there? So MUC5AC is up, that makes you think about chronic bronchitis.
Asthma.
Yeah. There's lung function abnormalities there. All of it looks concerning, I would say, for individuals who are going to be doing this long term.
Right.
Was there anything in the data that surprised you? Anything that you think people wouldn't have thought of as a potential consequence?
We didn't see too much difference between the exposure subgroup in terms of like cannabis plus vaping, cannabis plus cigarette, cannabis plus vaping plus cigarette. I would have presumed that triple, that cannabis smoking, vaping, and cigarette use would be the worst for you. He didn't necessarily see that. That said, we may be underpowered. And I do think that probably more study needs to go into those kind of maximum exposures, the triple exposures here. Similarly, because the bronchoscopy subset was a smaller cohort, we probably couldn't make too many conclusions about if you were triple inhaling, what would happen. So I suppose that is one thing that I just think we need more data on and more research on, is what happens to these people who are doing all three. And so that would be one thing. So yeah, not huge differences amongst those subgroups. Probably need to work on that a little bit more though.
Something I thought was interesting was in the epithelial data, you had an upregulation of T2 inflammation and maybe to a degree a downregulation of more neutrophil related pathways. And I maybe reflecting my bias as somebody who does quite a bit of neutrophil stuff, I think about smoking as being often an intensely neutrophilic process, an injury process. Do you think that tells us anything about potential consequences of long-term smoking, increased asthma rates, for example, or am I overinterpreting that data?
Well, yeah, these participants were not known to have asthma. Could they have been having subclinical asthma or something that just hadn't been picked up by their providers? Sure. Is this a pre-asthma phenotype? I think that's all speculative. Does this impact their ability to fight off respiratory infections down the line? I think that's a question that remains. My colleague, Jay Hirota in McMaster, has looked at COVID-19, and there's been a sort of increase in COVID-19 in cannabis smokers that they have found in one of their cohorts. So I think those are potential downstream consequences. We did collect exacerbation data along the way that we're currently working on. So that may be an interesting output to see whether they are having more events similar to an asthma exacerbation or COPD exacerbation. But I think because of the downregulation in Th17, the question remains whether they actually may have more respiratory infections and maybe at more risk for that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. My last question, I think, is what are you going to do next? Or what do you think people should be doing next to look at this impact of cannabis on the lung?
Well, we have a few projects still going from this cohort that we're currently working on. So we do actually have the 16S microbiome from the epithelial cell, the bronchial washing, bronchoalveolar lavage, and oral wash that one of my students is working on. We have the exacerbation data. We have single cell data as well that we're currently working on from these bronchoscopy samples so that we could actually take a look at those inflammatory pathways on a more granular level. We have much more imaging data that we're actually still working on. It's just a snapshot, what we put in the ERJ paper. There's a lot more CT MRI integration, a lot more analysis of diffusion and other MRI parameters. So there's actually a lot that we're working on just with this cohort that's going to come down the line. We also have epigenetic data, DNA methylation data that we have from the airway cells. So a lot of that's coming. The next step for us is actually we have started a vaping cohort as well, using very similar technologies and similar methodologies. So to put a plug out, if people are in various cities across Canada, they can sign up for our cloud study, the Canadian Lung Outcomes for Users of Vaping Devices, cloudstudy.ca. So if anyone's listening and wants to join our study, we are open for business. So that's coming down the pipeline as well. And so maybe we'll be able to ask some of these, cannabis vaping questions and compare to our cohort. So we're excited about that and hope in a few years can share those data with you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast, but also for publishing your paper in the ERJ. Really great discussion. I think there'll be a huge amount of interest in learning more about the effects of cannabis on the lung. So the paper is the Canadian Users of Cannabis Smoke Study, the Canuck study. It's published in the ERJ. So do go online and read that at the ERJ website. And please join us again next month for the next ERJ podcast. Every month we pick a new paper to discuss a new topic with the lead author or lead authors, and delighted to have you join us for this month's. Remember to breathe in fresh air and nothing else, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks again, Janice.
Thank you.